And good morning, everybody, and apologies that I was late and missed that first session. I was both battling with the French underground system and optimizing my travel so that I didn't have to fly, but that meant that I was a bit late. Let's just see if I can get this to work. Ah, good, thank you. So I've broken this into three sections, and the paper is similarly split across these two key areas, one of which is maritime transport costs and some thoughts around how they might change as a result of greenhouse gas-related policy in particular, and then some of the consequences of that potential change in terms of impacts on transport and global trade. This is not in the paper, so I just wanted to use this as a way to give a bit of context to the presentation. It starts in many ways with the Marshall Islands, which is a small group of atolls and islands, about 1,000, about the size of France in terms of land area, if you were to include the ocean. And they were involved in the IMO because they're second or third biggest flag state, depending on exactly which year you take the reference. And their foreign minister is was particularly exercised on the subject of greenhouse gas emissions. Tony de Brum took attention to what was being said at the IMO in 2015, when there was a lot of rhetoric about there being no cap on shipping emissions, that shipping was 2 to 3% of the problem and too small to be something that anyone needed to pay attention to. And he asked for that to change. One of the explanations being that the Marshall Islands is one of the most vulnerable countries in the world. Its average height above sea level is 2 meters. That's the highest point in the country, which is 10 meters above sea level. And that sort of initiation of the conversation at the IMO has graduated over time to the IMO's greenhouse gas reduction objectives and the greenhouse gas initial strategy, which was launched in April 2018. But I wanted to just mention a couple of things that have happened since then to reinforce this narrative and the logic that I'll flow from it. So one of them is the IPCC's 1.5 report, which was released in October, November last year. This shows the pathways that are required in order to achieve those objectives, approximately a halving of greenhouse gas emissions in the next 10 years, and consistent emission reductions across all forms of greenhouse gas emission. Another is the arrival of Greta Thunberg from Sweden, who has produced a monumental change in the way that the youth have engaged in this topic and tried to express the priority that needs to be paid. And that has even filtered through into the UK, one of the more apathetic societies in many ways. And I wanted to use this as an example of that. Some might have seen this interruption to the Brexit debates in the Houses of Parliament a couple of weeks ago by some protesters who took their clothes off. And that's a good illustration of how bad things have got, because British people tend to be rather reserved and wait until the last minute before they have to do something like this, let alone superglue themselves to the glass, which is what then happened next. So that was just a relatively trivial example of how this is entering mainstream democracy in a way that hasn't before, that gives some justification to why some of the speed of transition, maybe not as fast as IPCC 1.5 requires us to achieve, but getting towards it, is now permeating many sectors, including shipping. There's an added complication to shipping's challenge, which is that we have, within the initial strategy, an obligation to pay as much attention to the Paris Agreement as we have to pay to the UNFCCC's concept of common but differentiated responsibilities, respective capabilities, CBDR-RC, which is a concept which loosely means that we can't just place all of the burden on the developing economies, and we certainly should do more in the developed economies. This graph is an attempt to show by economic status across developed and developing the magnitude of the CO2 emissions on different routes. So you can see that only about 16% are associated with trade between two developed economies. The majority, nearly 70%, is occurring between a developing and a developed economy, or two developing economies. So there's a strong bias in the case of shipping to the CO2 emissions being associated with trade between developing economies, or at least including a developing economy partner, which is unlike aviation and therefore places the shipping sector's decarbonisation transition in a slightly different context, certainly from a policy perspective. So what does that transition look like? I mentioned already the IMO's initial greenhouse gas reduction strategy. This is a graph depicting the scale of change that's required. We have a business as usual trajectory and a short history back to 2008 of what has happened historically in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, with those emissions on the y-axis and time on the x-axis. The reductions from 2008 occurred predominantly, we believe, due to the use of slow steaming and also the use of larger ships on some routes, and a focus on energy efficiency. And that reduction has started to plateau out, and we're seeing signs that the increase in emissions is happening again. And with projections that if nothing else changes, having locked in some efficiency gains, that could now increase due to demand increases, which obviously you spoke more about in the earlier session. What needs to happen, according to the IMO strategy, is an absolute halving of emissions by 2050, but with ambitions to go beyond that, hence this use of the downwards arrow and the mention of, if possible, to reach a sort of 100% objective by 2050, which is right at the end of the scope of ambition that you would need if you wanted to hit that 1.5 degree objective. It's the highest risk way of doing that. So if that's the context, here is an attempt to try and put some detail on what that might mean in terms of costs. Because there's still a bit of uncertainty as exactly what pathway the IMO might end on, I've got two scenarios here coming from an IMO submission, ISWG 1-INF2, that we were involved in. And they show fuels pathways for the sector over the next 3 decades. The fuel mix is represented by the different colours, with energy content on the y-axis, time on the x-axis out to 2050. And the conventional fuels, heavy fuel oil, marine diesel oil, soon to be low sulfur heavy fuel oil, make up the dark blue and light blue segments, with bioenergy related fuels in the yellow segment, a small amount associated with liquid natural gas, the turquoise segment, if you can see it, and then the brown sector, which we've called hydrogen in these graphs, but is a hydrogen proxy. So it could be ammonia, it could be methanol produced from a renewable hydrogen feedstock. It's a zero emission fuel, essentially, with zero upstream emissions. We've spent a lot of time trying to understand the relative competitiveness of the different options that you might have in order to achieve that fuels pathway, because this is where we think we can get insights into what the costs might be and therefore what the consequences of those costs. So here's an excerpt of a paper that we produced with Lloyd's Register a couple of years ago, with estimates of the relative competitiveness of different technologies, here ranging from battery electric to a hybrid solution where you have a combination of hydrogen and batteries, a hydrogen fuel cell ship, or the use of hydrogen in an internal combustion engine, and then 2 variants very similar on ammonia and a biofuel variant. And in relative terms, the analysis is finding that at the moment the biofuel option does appear to be the most competitive, so would be an indicative way to set costs. However, the availability of biofuels at the scale required by the sector, of the order of 200 to 300 million tonnes, does not currently match up that potential production isn't apparently available. And so most of our work at the moment is done on the basis of ammonia options being the most cost effective and scalable and available in the medium to long run. Battery electric is something which we've omitted from most of our further analysis. It's very challenging for deep sea shipping because of the range requirements of the vessels. So we're taking an example here of a large or medium now sized TU capacity container ship. So most of these are going to be liquid fuel solutions, and they're relatively similar in some terms in costs. In order to estimate what we think this then turns into, we've got a model which is not unlike some of the work that ITF and IEA have been doing in this area. We use that model to estimate how increments in a carbon price, purely to simulate that concept, not because it's necessarily the policy solution, but to represent how a lever applied to the sector's emissions might consequently result in changes to its emissions trajectories. And this is some of the background input assumptions associated with that, which I'm going to rattle through just in the interests of getting onto results. They're in the paper. In essence, we have 2 scenarios, one with a high renewable fuel price, which is what sets the hydrogen price essentially, and then another with a low renewable fuel price. By that I mean electricity, renewable electricity obtained from solar and wind or nuclear. The outputs that we get from running that analysis give us an estimate of marginal abatement cost curves, and they're depicted here relative to a 2008 baseline. So that's why you can get increases in emissions, hence the negative values on the x-axis, or strong positive reductions relative to the 2008 baseline. The carbon price is illustrated on the y-axis, and the 4 different curves represent different points in time, grouped for 2030 and 2050, and also different assumptions about availability of bioenergy. So bioenergy is a key uncertainty in a lot of our modelling. But in the ultimate case, it's not driving the level of carbon price that the sector needs to achieve in order to reach some of the very high rates of greenhouse gas emission reduction in 2050 that are being required by that IMO initial strategy. This is the case for high renewable fuel price, and you'll see there's a sort of plateau that occurs around $300 a tonne carbon price, and that's broadly because we've gone through the region where we can expect to have further energy efficiency increases, and then we reach a threshold of carbon price by which we can incentivize the adoption of zero-emission fuels, and there's a tail end of the fleet, which is always the older ships, for which it's more expensive and costly to create a transition. So we skip those as a detail that we would come back to. Biofuel has the impact of helping to reduce the initial carbon price needed to create significant reductions. If we have a much lower renewable electricity price, then this curve, or these sets of curves, look significantly better. And that's one of the things explained in this graph. The carbon price required to reach over 80% absolute reductions in 2050 is below $100 a tonne. And so the big driver here is what can we expect very large-scale renewable electricity to be priced at in the timescales that we need, so the 2030s and the 2040s, and can we link up the production of zero-emission fuels to that infrastructure. So without going into more detail on that, I'm going to skip again and just say we're coming to the point of realization that the sector's transition is not significantly different from what economists are estimating other sectors of the global economy to need in order to reach significant reduction. This is a panel that was put together by World Bank and IMF, who came to the conclusion that of the order of $50 to $100 per tonne on carbon was needed, which, as you'll see from the previous slides, is not dissimilar if we can imagine that scenario with the lower cost renewable electricity. So I need to skip very quickly on to the subject of what that scale of cost. So if you'll take from that a high-level estimate of costs, we use $50 to $250 per tonne carbon price to represent the range of uncertainty. The next question is, how might that impact states? And this first point is to do with how that particular sensitivity is tackled within the International Maritime Organization. This is coming straight from the strategy. It says the impacts on states of a policy measure should be assessed and taken into account as appropriate before adoption of the measure. Particular attention should be paid to the needs of developing countries, especially small island developing states and least developing countries. And then disproportionately negative impacts should be assessed and addressed as appropriate. And a lot of that is obviously clearly lacking in detail, but it gives us some sense of where we can expect a need to be conscious of the needs of certain countries and where certain types of trade impact need to be carefully assessed. Also within the initial strategy, there's a list of the areas of impact that are particularly thought of by that community, the International Maritime Organization, as those that we need to be sensitive to, and I've listed those 8 criteria here. They are in many ways crowdsourced from the IMO plenary, so they do not necessarily represent what would be a very carefully constituted list, but they give us some sense of what might need to be incorporated in analysis in the coming years. I think we've touched on a lot of this already. This is where the potential for an increase in cost comes from. Some of it represented by the hydrogen-powered ship you see on the left come from increased capital costs and fuel costs. Some of it may be actually increased capital costs but lower operating costs. And we've represented how some of that might feed through into changes in trade cost by this diagram in the paper, coming from a paper by a colleague of mine, Isabelle Rojan, which attempts to show that across voyage costs and capital costs we could see an increase in ship running costs, which might feed through as one of the components that influences maritime transport costs, and then ultimately maritime transport costs being a subset of trade costs. So to try and articulate what this might mean, I'm going to leverage some of the data that's already in the literature, because my paper in this section moves into a literature review rather than our own analysis. On the two bar charts here, we have a potential future decarbonisation maritime transport cost with a carbon price applied at the lower bound range of values, which gives us an increase in specific maritime transport costs of somewhere between 0.4 and 16%, depending on the type of commodity, because a lot of this is very commodity and ship type specific. Ultimately, from the importer's perspective, which is one of the areas which is sensitive to those lists that we saw in the initial strategy, the headline that we're deploying at the moment is that that seems to be a relatively small increase in overall cost, because transport cost is only a small percentage of the overall price of a good as you consume it in an importing country, of the order of 1% for the type of carbon price that we've represented here. And obviously, if you scale that up to give you a worst case scenario for some of the upper bound carbon prices, that's indicative of how much that could further increase. The other perspective that we're trying to incorporate in our thinking is that of the exporter. There's a classical example here at the moment, which is Brazil exporting iron ore to China, for which its main competitor is Australia in many cases, and Australia has a larger market share. So the question that is often thought about here is, to what extent might we see market share switch as a consequence of a flat carbon price applied evenly across the sector to make a country such as Australia have a slight advantage and share a potential for increase in share of market. So the consequence that we're interested in evaluating here is the potential for that decline in exports from state C, a potential increase in exports from state B. So I should have set A, B, and C up to actually be Australia, Brazil, and China. But we've made it super confusing by C actually being Brazil, B actually being Australia, and A being China. That was a political sensitivity, obviously. So there's a case where you can imagine that potential switch happening, and for a lot of the evaluation, we've been thinking about the application of computational general equilibrium modelling. And there is literature that has included some use of that so far. A number of references are included in the paper, summarised here. And the very high-level takeaway that I've got time to relay here is that literature is saying that broadly at the global level, the impacts on volumes are very small, the impacts on global GDP look small, and the potential for modal shift also looks small. But the potential for impacts on specific countries could be high. And that gets to the root of that concern in the IMO debates about the sensitivities of certain countries, LDCs and SIDS, who have got the potential to be significantly impacted, and that needs obviously to be evaluated. The final piece of substance that I wanted to share was that because of those potential impacts, and I don't want to preconceive anything about how the IMO will interpret that risk of disproportionate negative impacts that's alluded to in the initial strategy, there is a scenario where we could see policy used to try and compensate or re-equalise against disruptions caused by a flat policy across the whole fleet. One way to mitigate these risks could be to have exemptions, so certain countries could be given exemptions from the greenhouse gas mitigation policy for an initial phase. Certain routes or ships or cargoes could be given exemptions. Another way could be that if there was a carbon price raising revenue, that could be used and recycled back into the sector, either to reduce those negative impacts by actually investing in infrastructure to help with the offset of the increase in transport costs, either to have some beneficial impacts on mitigation and adaptation plans in those countries, or separately to decarbonise the maritime transport sector, potentially reducing the cost of its transition and therefore helping to reduce the transport cost increase that it's causing, it's at risk of causing negative impacts on. And a third category that we could see some activity in is capacity building and development, which is conventionally how IMO has dealt with this subject in the past. So to conclude, we live in a very extraordinary landscape in many senses. Maybe everyone says that all the time, but for people to take their clothes off in the Houses of Parliament, things must be fairly extraordinary. That's my evidence base. In 2030, we will have hit 1.5 degrees, probably. None of the policies we have at the moment are set to avoid that. 44 countries in the world will be in major existential and economic crisis. and there'll be political pressure driven by disasters and impacts that will increase over time. So this is the political context, the landscape, the pressures on the governments that the debate at IMO is not going to reduce. The technology costs within the sector are a subject of high uncertainty. We know the sector's move from fossil fuels will need to start by the 2030s if we're going to get close to those IMO objectives, and an estimate of the potential cost increase for the sector can be derived from the modelling of carbon price. We're putting some bounds on that in a very broad estimate, 50 to 250. And then on the subject of how that can have consequences for trade, there are reasons why that's a subject that's receiving particular prominence, more in relative terms than in absolute terms at the moment. We don't see at the moment evidence that there could be significant global impacts on trade volume, but I'd be very interested to test that on other people's perceptions here. We think there could be risks for individual countries, and that those risks vary depending on the perspective they take, with some countries being more import and others being more export-oriented. We don't believe there's very much work so far that's been done on transport cost at the upper bound end of the cost increase. So a lot of the analysis so far has talked about carbon price of the order of $50 a tonne, because that feels sort of politically acceptable. But in some of the more extreme decarbonisation scenarios with less technology change, flexibility, those could be underestimates of the price. So we're interested in work that could go at higher cost. And then generally the point is that we think further work is needed, particularly to understand the case of SIDS and LDCs, and also how they might be impacted by policies that are attempting to remedy their impacts. I think I've overrun, I'm sorry, but I was trying to move quite fast.